Renewal of baptismal covenant. A fourth reason for God's choice of the Sabbath as a sign of a mutual belonging relationship is suggested by the fact that the day provides a weekly renewal of the baptismal covenant vow. In the New Testament, baptism is not described in covenantal language, though it fulfills the very function of making the entrance of the believer into the church, the New Covenant community, which is the body of Christ. We were all baptized into one body. 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. A reason for the limited use of the Old Testament covenant model in the New Testament to describe the relation of the early Christians to one another and to Christ is suggested by the Roman prohibition of secret societies. For the Romans, a covenant meant an illegal society. Christians, for reasons of prudence, may have avoided a terminology that raised suspicion of political treason. Though the distinctive Old Testament covenant terminology is absent in the New Testament description of baptism, its basic concept is present. This is indicated by the association of baptism with the Exodus event, 1 Corinthians 10 verse 1 and 2, and with circumcision, Colossians 2 verse 11 to 13, both of which are clear covenant experiences. In fact, as well stated by Louis Tamenga, much of Bible history is covenant history. The fundamentalist evangelical world has, by and large, failed to grasp the fact that it is the covenantal relationship between God and His people that binds the scriptures together. How is the Sabbath related to the covenant experience of baptism? Basically, in its meaning and function. Baptism is a symbolic reenactment of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection in the life of the believer who enters into covenant with Christ by dying to sin and raising into a new moral life. Romans 6 verse 3 to 4. Does the Sabbath share this baptismal meaning and experience of death and resurrection? Is the Sabbath, like baptism, a form of renouncement and renewal? Philip Melanchthon acknowledges these two meanings of the Sabbath in his Lossy Commune, saying, after the fall, the Sabbath was re-established when the gracious promise was given that there would be a second peace with God, that the Son of God would die and would rest in death until the resurrection. So now, in us, our Sabbath should be such a dying and resurrection with the Son of God, so that God may again have His place of habitation, peace, and joy in us, so that He may impart to us His wisdom, righteousness, joy, so that through us God may again be praised eternally. Let this meaning of the Sabbath be further pondered by God-fearing men. In compliance with Melanchthon's exhortation, let us ponder this meaning of the Sabbath, renouncement. Like baptism, the Sabbath does signify renouncement. No two persons can become one without renouncing certain rights in order to gain greater privileges. Through the Sabbath, God invites human beings to renounce several things in order for them to receive His greater gifts. In the first place, they are to renounce the security of the weekly work. Exodus 20, verse 10. Even when circumstances seem unfavorable, in plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. Exodus 34, verse 21. A. Martin rightly notes that in the context of Jewish life, the interruption of work, especially at plowing and harvest time, was a general form of renouncement, which could easily result in less food available. Even today, however, Sabbath keeping has, for some persons, entailed real sacrifice and renouncement. This is particularly true in countries where the right to be free from work is in order to observe the 7th day as God's holy day does not exist. Many books of Acts could be written to recount the heroic witness of past and present believers who have chosen and do choose to renounce better jobs, promotion, or pay, sometimes even the very likelihood and freedom, rather than to disown their commitment to God. Like baptism, the Sabbath also remains renouncement of that greediness and selfishness, which, though symbolically buried under the baptismal waters, continually tend to reappear and thus needs to be overcome. Some persons have been made slaves, but many more have chosen to become slaves of their grasping greediness. The later work and would wish others to work for them all 7 days out of 7 in order to gain more and more and be satisfied with less and less. The Sabbath is designed to cure such insatiable greediness by enjoining to rest. That is, to stop being greedy and start being grateful. It commands to take time not to seek more material goods, but to gratefully acknowledge the bounties received. A grateful heart is indispensable for maintaining a meaningful mutual belonging relationship and for experiencing inner rest and peace. Like baptism, the Sabbath means also renouncement of self-sufficiency. Through the Sabbath, the confession of surrender to Christ, which the believer makes at baptism, is renounced every week. The success a Christian achieves in his work may make him feel secure and self-sufficient, thus forgetful of his dependency upon God. Lest I be full and deny thee, say, who is the Lord? Proverbs 30, verse 9. The Sabbath, by enjoining cessation from work, invites the believer to glance away from his own work, from his own achievements, and to look instead to God's work and working in him. During the week, a Christian may feel worthy of salvation because of all that he does. But on the Sabbath, as he ceases from his works, he becomes conscious of his human dependency upon God, recognizing that it is not his doing, but God's doing that saves. The Sabbath forbids a Christian to have faith in his own plans and wishes and in a justification and deliverance which he can make for himself in his own ability and achievement. What it really forbids him is not work, but trust in his work. The Sabbath then provides a weekly opportunity to renew the baptismal confession of self-renouncement in order to allow the omnipotent grace of God to have the first and last word at every point. In two senses, Sabbath keeping may be a more significant confession of commitment than may be a than than circumcision was in the Old Testament, or than baptism is in the Christian dispensation. First, because circumcision and baptism are covenant signs received generally at a tender age, when infants or teenagers do not fully understand the implications. Second, because both of them are a one time commitment rite. On the contrary, Sabbath keeping represents not a one time, but a weekly, lifetime renewal of the commitment made to God in one's youth. What this means then is that the person who habitually disregards the Sabbath chooses rather to do his own pleasure. Isaiah 58:13 reveals not a sudden or a momentary weakness, but rather a deep rooted and willful rejection of his baptismal commitment to God. This is why the prophets equate Sabbath breaking with apostasy or rebellion. Ezekiel 20, verse 13 to 21, Nehemiah 13, verse 18, Jeremiah 17:23. Because it is not a passing inordinate desire, but a permanent attitude of disobedience. The Christian life could be described as a love affair with the Lord, which is sealed through baptism and cultivated through the Sabbath. Or one might say that the Sabbath strengthens the sacred vows of faithfulness made to God at baptism. Renewal. Even as the water in baptism has the dual meaning of death and a new life, so the rest of the Sabbath signifies both renouncement and renewal. In baptism, if baptism be regarded as the point of entrance into the Christian life, the Sabbath is the weekly renewal of that initial commitment. This weekly renewal is made possible through the time the Sabbath affords to take stock and ascertain where one stands. The opportunity the Sabbath provides to have a special rendezvous with oneself, with others, and with God results in physical, social, and spiritual renewal. The physical renewal, recreation, the Sabbath rest provides, differ from the rest experience of the weekdays. During the week, one can at best rest from work, but not from the thought of it. The businessman goes home with his work in his briefcase or in his mind. The student must prepare for the next day's assignments or tests. The housekeeper must plan for tomorrow's meals and cleaning. The anxiety over tasks that remain to be done occupies the mind even while the body rests. As a result, a person sometimes feels more tired in the morning than before he went to bed. On the Sabbath, however, a Christian should, and can rest not only from work, but also from the thought of it, knowing that on that day he need not worry about time clocks, deadlines, tests, productions, or competition. On the Sabbath, the body can rest because the mind is at rest, and the mind is at rest because it rests in God. The Sabbath contributes also to social renewal by strengthening those relationships established through baptism. The daily work scatters the immediate family members as well as the church members in different directions. leaving little time to cultivate marital, parental, and fraternal relationships. During a busy work week, it is easy to forget the needs of members of the body of Christ, into whom we were all baptized. 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. Sometimes even the members of one's own family are neglected. On the Sabbath, as the believer experiences a fresh assurance of God's presence and love, he is motivated and challenged to strengthen neglected relationships, to alleviate the suffering of others, to share with all, friends and foes, his friendship, fellowship, and concern. This service, which is rendered on and through the Sabbath, renews his renews and strengthens the covenant relationship with God and his people established at baptism. Most important of all, the Sabbath is a time of spiritual renewal. It is a time when the believer renews his baptismal commitment by taking time to remember and appreciate God's saving activities. In a sense, the believer on each Sabbath is baptized anew into Christ's death through the renouncement experience described earlier and into Christ's resurrection through the spiritual renewal the day provides. The latter takes place on the Sabbath, especially through the private and communal worship experience, which differs substantially from that of the weekdays. Sabbath worship is not a moment of meditation squeezed into a busy workday program, but rather it is a whole day when earthly concerns are laid aside, when the many distracting voices are silenced in order to acknowledge God's worship, to experience His presence, and to hear more distinctly His voice. Through this special encounter with God, the believer receives fresh forgiveness. He brings order into his fragmented daily life. He reestablishes his moral consciousness. He gains a new set of divine goals for his life. He receives fresh inspiration and grace to do the will of God. This spiritual renewal that the Sabbath provides to the new life begun at baptism serves to strengthen and enrich covenantal relationship between God and the believer. Good news of belonging, the Sabbath.